Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone again for joining us. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. I know people are joining from many different places. This is officially starting our webinar on the cost of silence, confidentiality clauses, and the global debt crisis. My name is Erin Houlihan. I am a senior advisor on governance at NDI, and I will be your moderator today. A few logistics notes before we actually get started. We do have French interpretation available. To switch over to French or to select French or English language, please locate the globe button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select your preferred language. Note also, please, that we're recording this session today, and we will share that out later for future reference. And at the end of the panel discussion, we will have an opportunity for everyone to ask questions of our panelists. So now we can get started. A little bit of background on the issues that we will discuss today. The Secretary General of UNCTAD, UN body on trade and development, has called the current global debt crisis one of the biggest threats to global peace, security, and financial stability facing the world today. This is not hyperbole. In 2025, central government debt rose to nearly 94% of GDP globally. It is expected to reach 100% of GDP at the end of this decade. Transactions are increasingly complex and more difficult to scrutinize. Borrowing by state-owned enterprises, which is guaranteed by the government, is growing. Today, at least 3.4 billion people live in countries that pay more in interest to service loans than on health and education services. Yet the scale of the problem is actually worse than data reveal. Studies show that hidden debt is a remarkably pervasive feature of the sovereign debt crisis. It involves financial obligations borne or guaranteed by a government that are undisclosed, mischaracterized, or deliberately obscured from parliamentary and public oversight and from other creditors. While public debt itself is a critical tool for governments to finance infrastructure and other drivers of economic growth, hidden debt undermines credibility, weakens resilience to shocks, and has very real impacts on people's daily lives. It represents a democracy deficit and a failure of governance, and it is frequently tied to corruption. The problem of hidden debt is rooted in a combination of complex and interacting factors, including deficiencies in national laws that define and regulate debt, insufficient and ineffective oversight by legislatures and other oversight bodies, and weaknesses in disclosure rules and right to information laws. But in addition, a particular concern is the rising use of confidentiality clauses in sovereign debt instruments. These provisions are frequently used by Chinese lenders, among other creditors, to impose confidentiality on the borrower. This violates the public's right to know and increases the risk of misuse and corruption. A recent report that was co-published by NDI, the Open Government Partnership, and Transparency International examines the 6 most common fictions used by lenders and borrowers to justify the use of confidentiality clauses, and we counter these with facts. To be clear, there is never a justification for confidentiality in sovereign debt, because public debt is the public's debt. To discuss these problems of hidden debt, we are joined today by 4 distinguished experts. I would like to thank them for their time in joining us, as well as all of the participants that are here with us today. I would also like to thank Transparency International as our co-host of this webinar. First, we will hear from Daniela Pino-Piñeres. Daniela is the program lead, Protection of Public Resources at Transparency International based in Berlin. She is an expert on anti-corruption, public debt, and sustainable development. Second, we are joined by Patricia Miranda. Patricia is the Global Advocacy Director at Latin America Network for Economic and Social Justice, known as LatinDad. She specializes in debt, finance, international financial institutions, and financial architecture. Our third speaker is Matar Sal. Matar is the general coordinator of the Civil Forum, the Senegalese chapter of Transparency International. He is a legal expert specializing in good governance and transparency. And our fourth speaker is Alexander Rithi. Alexander is the head of programs at the Institute for Social Accountability, known as TISA, Kenya. He is an expert in public financial management, and specializes in budget analysis, zero-based budgeting, and governance. As we listen today, we will have 2 rounds of questions, so each speaker will present twice. In the first round, we are going to focus on the challenges of hidden debt and the root causes at the global, regional, and country level. In the second round, we will explore potential solutions and entry points, increase debt transparency and accountability. First, we turn to Daniela. Daniela, again, thank you for joining us. Can you please give an overview of hidden debt challenges and the main manifestations globally? And could you also please address some of the issues and findings in our recent joint publication on confidentiality clauses? Thank you.
Great. No, thank you very much, Erin, and thank you to all the other speakers that are joining us today and to all the participants. It's a pleasure for me to co-host this webinar and to bring this very relevant topic. Maybe just to build on some of the data and the information you were giving at the beginning, Erin, in terms of which are the costs of hidden debt and why it's so relevant that we discuss hidden debt today. So you were already discussing the need of the disclosure, not only because it's very relevant on maintaining and monitoring that sustainability. That data is key to credibly assess and communicate and define interest rates that, as you were mentioning, in several countries and in several regions can be until 40% of the total revenue of specific countries. And of course, the disclosure and the information is key to inform debt relief processes and debt restructuring processes. Without information, it would be very difficult to really determine the debt sustainability of a country. And then, of course, what we have seen is that when there are instances of hidden debt, these have repeatedly triggered both confidence shocks, but also economic crisis in different countries. And I'm sure that some of our fellow panelists today would touch into that. But I think you have also mentioned a topic that is less discussed, but is also as equal as relevant when we're discussing hidden debt. And is that when debt is opaque or when debt is hidden, basically we don't have any traceability or any information to track how governments are taking guarantees, how governments are taking loans, and under which conditions. What this means is that in many cases, governments or specific decision makers that are acquiring new debt may do it putting as guarantee critical assets of a country without the proper oversight and approval by the necessary institutions, as well as proper information from citizens and civil society. And what we have also seen from repetitive cases, including Mozambique, but others, is that in many cases when debt occurs hidden or when it is opaque, foreign loans can also be diverted for the personal enrichment of public officials, their associates, and to the detriment of future generations. So basically, this can be lost to corruption. And what we have seen over the last years is that even though the consequences of hidden debt are very common and are well known, still up until 2025, according to the World Bank, 20% of countries that are eligible for international development assistance still do not publish any information on their debt. And according to a report by the IMF that reviewed different legal frameworks on over 60 countries, they identified that less than 50% of the countries analyzed included specific debt disclosure requirements under the legal frameworks. And even when they did, this is mostly focused on central government loans without taking a look into other type of debt contracted by, among others, state-owned enterprises, including other type of contingent liabilities, specific instruments such as collateralized debt, extra budgetary funds, and swap lines. debts. So what we're seeing is that even when certain information of the debt is being published, we are not getting into the granular information that we would need to exercise the proper oversight and basically to guarantee that the funds are invested in the way they should be. And finally, maybe just to close on this first line of manifestations, and you have also included what we have seen in the last 10 years or more, is that there's an increasing use of confidentiality clauses. Generally, or before, the confidentiality clauses used to be implemented to protect the borrowers and critical information from the borrowers. But what we're seeing is that now these are being used by the lenders to prevent critical information on loans to be shared with other creditors, with oversight institutions, and of course also with the citizens and civil society. And what we're seeing in many cases is that in most cases, these confidentiality clauses also prevent the disclosure of the existence of the loan itself, of course, being a key driver and manifestation of hidden debt in the last countries. And just to close and to continue the conversation, what we have seen are three kind of like main drivers that have enabled this hidden debt, but are also enabling this rise of confidentiality clauses. The first one are deficiencies in national legal frameworks. I already mentioned from the study of the IMF, but just to go a little bit more in detail, what we are seeing is that legal frameworks do not include specific definitions of what is considered public debt, and have very inadequate requirements for the proactive disclosure. So this is not only the reactive disclosure once this information is asked by an oversight institution, by a citizen or others, but also the proactive and this open by default disclosure of all types of debt, especially looking at non-centralized and collateral debt, as we were mentioning before. The second point, which we mentioned in terms of confidentiality, is that in many cases, first, there are no proper laws that regulate confidentiality. So even when confidentiality is mentioned, this is mentioned in a very broad manner, which gives a lot of discretion to borrowing countries and governments to define what they consider confidential and what they do not consider confidential. And even when there are instruments such as access to information laws or request to information laws, these include very broad exceptions of what is considered confidential, as Erin was mentioned, and as we have included as part of our publication on confidentiality clauses. And can link confidentiality from national security to other types of provisions within the law without clearly defining what a provision under national security should be, and without specifying which information should be confidential instead of the whole loan as itself. And maybe just to close, even when we have this strong request to information laws at the national level, there is no congruence between public financial management acts or even public debt management acts and request and access to information regulation. So even when the access to information specifies clearly what information should be confidential and which information should not, this does not speak necessarily to the way in which information on debt is being managed and disclosed, as this is being given in another direction and under another regulation. So we also need to bring these two areas of regulation together. But maybe I'll close it here for now and back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniela. Lot to digest there. And I think particularly hitting on the intersections between it's not just one root cause. It is a broader challenge with definitions in the legal framework, capacities, and then the use of confidentiality clauses is really exploiting these existing gaps within the system and flipping what used to be protections for the borrower onto preventing the borrower from sharing. Thank you so much. That's a global perspective. And now we'll turn to a regional view of this situation. Patricia, would you please explain your perspective on the current hidden debt situation within Latin America across the region, and perhaps touch on some recent trends that you're observing and why this issue is so difficult for civil society organizations such as yourself, as well as governments to address? Thank you. Patricia.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It seems my connectivity is not that good, so if if I need to turn off my camera, please let me know. Well, to continue what Daniela was saying, because we identify, and I think most, especially borrowing countries, will identify with this diagnosis. I would like to address some gaps in my region at different levels. Some of them because of the time as well. But one of them, and you mentioned it initially, is the state-owned enterprises debt and subnational debt, which it's becoming more important in several Latin American countries, but it's still very complex to collect all the information. And in some cases, even state-owned enterprises are kind of protected, we could say, and they don't need to report to the central government, for instance. So it's still challenging to collect all this information. But at some point, it would and it could become a fiscal risk for a central government. The second gap I would like to mention is the debt that the public sector has with goods and services suppliers. And we just a few days ago have the latest case in Paraguay, for instance, when the payment to a supplier is made after the contract agreement, or it surpasses the fiscal year. So for the next year, this commitment with certain supplier becomes a debt, and depending on the amount and on several conditions, this is also a part of the public debt that could be considered as hidden until it is until we can see it in the budget. As a third point of a gap, I would like to mention, and Daniela talked about interest rates and the financial conditions that are not always known. But in addition to this, I would like to add the external debt conditionalities. And for countries in Latin America for decades, this has been a key issue, and it's not always known. The citizens are not aware or don't know what are the other commitments that as citizens we need to fulfill as citizens in order to get this loan. And it can be different type of conditionalities since type loans, but also in political conditionalities, for instance, privatization of public companies or public enterprises or public services that we have several cases in Latin America. And a fourth and final gap I would like to mention is the use of debt and the impacts. And this is still a challenge. People and citizens, even parliamentarians and other stakeholders, don't know, are not aware, we don't have plenty information of where certain loan or credit is going to, what kind of project. But the most important is the impact. And even in multilateral credits, for instance, or bilateral credits, it's not, we don't have usually good assessments of the impacts on the population, on the beneficiaries of these loans or of this debt. And it's worse if we talk about sovereign bonds or private creditors. It's not part of any agreement to have an assessment of what was the impact of a certain loan, of external debt in general. So I would like to address those gaps. And to the second point of your question, I think for civil society organizations, it is complex because it's very technical, and it's information that is basically a privilege for certain stakeholders or CSOs that work on that and that could have research and investigate more. But in general, it's if citizens and other civil society organizations don't know what kind of information could be useful for them, it's part of the problem. And on the other side, the information that is available is complex in itself because not everyone will be able to read a contract. It's not just to publish the contract and to put a contract on a website, because it's not easy to understand anyway, or just to have a lot of data, but if it's not easy to understand, or people cannot tell by that data if the debt in their country is sustainable or not, it's not that useful. So it's also important on the how data and information on that is going to be displaced for CSOs, but also for other stakeholders in a country. And regarding the challenges for governments or for the public sector, it's also a matter of time. Governments need to have time to deliver and disseminate all this information. They also need to have a capacity in terms of debt management. It is not only that the data is there, but they need to have a specific team and a mandate in terms of time to do this. Of course, as Daniela said, there are gaps in bylaws and in countries' constitutions for borrowers and lenders. But in general, it's also a lack of will. And this is a shame, since having access to this information is a public right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. You covered a lot there in a short time. Impressive. Just a couple things that you said that I think were particularly notable for this and added some new information is one, also the issue of subnational debt. Because again, that the central government typically guarantees subnational debt. And though, as you said, the ability to disclose that information to the government itself, even separately from the public, tends to be a gap. You also mentioned the issue of conditionalities, which is a challenge in and of itself, but when you have confidentiality clauses in contracts that involve conditionalities that have policy implications for the impact to the public, that is particularly problematic. And many other things that you addressed there, but I think that it's very useful to know, and those issues are certainly not limited to Latin America. Thank you. So for our third speaker, we will turn to Matar Sal. Matar will be looking at this issue from a country level. Matar, in 2024, a comprehensive audit by the then new government in Senegal revealed billions of dollars in hidden debt that had been undertaken by the past administrations. Could you please briefly explain the hidden debt situation in Senegal and your analysis of the relationship between corruption and the debt crisis? Thank you. Matar.
Excusez-moi, je n'avais pas ouvert le micro. Ça va? Voilà, merci beaucoup. Donc, je disais, revenant sur la situation au Sénégal, vous l'avez rappelé, en 2024, un nouveau président a été élu, donc là, au mois de mars. Et là, il faut le dire, hein, donc le Sénégal est donc dans l'UEMOA. Et donc, dans le cadre de l'UEMOA, il y a la réglementation, n'est-ce pas, qui dit que, et également, c'est même donc transposé au niveau national, qui dit que après chaque élection d'un nouveau président, il faut faire la situation globale des finances publiques, et en particulier celle du budget de l'État et de son endettement. N'est-ce pas? Donc, c'est vraiment en application donc, de cette réglementation que les nouvelles autorités ont donc demandé à la Cour. Et là, la réglementation également dit que c'est la Cour des comptes qui procède à l'audit de la situation, n'est-ce pas, économique, notamment les aspects qui sont relatifs à l'endettement. Voilà. C'est en application de cette disposition, effectivement, que les autorités ont demandé à ce que la situation globale soit faite. Et donc là, la Cour des comptes a donc vraiment fait son travail consistant à auditer et donc véritablement à certifier vraiment donc la situation donc économique, notamment des comptes au Sénégal, et à publier donc vraiment le rapport. N'est-ce pas? Dans le cadre de ce rapport, effectivement, on a constaté que la Cour des comptes a dit que l'encours de la dette qui a été déclarée par les autorités à leur départ, c'est-à-dire le gouvernement sortant, n'est-ce pas, est de loin, donc vraiment plus bas que l'encours total, n'est-ce pas, de la dette. Effectivement, donc c'est dans ce cadre que les autorités ont parlé de dette cachée. Exemple, au moment du départ donc, du gouvernement qui était sur place, l'encours de la dette était estimé à moins de 80%, n'est-ce pas? Donc là, la Cour des comptes, donc après donc avec ce rapport, a dit que c'est à peu près 100%. Donc là, et effectivement, dans ce cadre, les autorités ont parlé de dette cachée. Et aussi, donc après la publication du rapport de la Cour des comptes, le FMI également a confirmé que vraiment le rapport de la Cour des comptes était fiable. Il y avait des dettes qui n'étaient pas déclarées. Et vraiment, c'est ce qui a amené la situation au Sénégal où on parlait de dette cachée. Maintenant, parlant de dette cachée aussi, donc là, il faut le dire, il y a toujours, donc vraiment, encore une fois, un manque de respect de la réglementation. Parce que si on respectait la réglementation, on ne serait pas dans une situation où on parlerait de dette cachée. Parce que donc, pour tout ce qui concerne les finances publiques, n'est-ce pas? Donc là, il y a une obligation de transparence, mais il y a une obligation de redevabilité. Donc là, ce qui fait qu'il y a quelque chose peut-être qui n'a pas été donc vraiment rendu public, il y a quelque chose qui n'a pas été donné comme information et dans ce cadre, effectivement, il y a cette situation. Maintenant, sur la question, le rapport entre cette dette cachée et la corruption, là, je pense que aussi, il faut le dire, le Forum civil ne saurait établir donc, de lien entre ce qui est considéré comme dette cachée au Sénégal et une quelconque corruption. Pourquoi? Parce que le rapport quand même de la Cour des comptes ne s'est pas prononcé sur l'utilisation de l'argent, sur la destination, n'est-ce pas, de l'argent, et par conséquent, il ne serait pas possible qu'on parle de est-ce que c'est de l'argent qui a été mal utilisé, est-ce que c'est de l'argent qui a été donc véritablement détourné et autres, n'est-ce pas? Donc là, vraiment, je pense que de ce point de vue, on ne pourrait pas le dire, mais quand même, donc là, ce qui est constant, c'est que c'est la juridiction compétente, habilitée, qui a fait la situation, c'est la Cour des comptes, et la Cour des comptes a dit qu'effectivement, il y a eu véritablement des dettes qui n'étaient pas déclarées et c'est ce qui est convenu donc d'appeler ici au Sénégal dettes cachées. Voilà donc en résumé un peu la situation, peut-être pour le Sénégal, en attendant s'il y a d'autres questions.
Thank you very much, Matar. That's interesting. Also, that you that the purpose of the audit is regulatory. Often, whenever there is a new government coming in or a political transition after a long-standing administration, there's the pressure for an audit and to review the books and other issues is high, and it is an opportunity to identify hidden or opaque debt among other issues. So that's good to know as a legal framework issue. Also, I think it's very interesting that, as you highlighted, that because the audit did not look at the uses of debt or the potential impacts of debt, it's potentially too early to identify whether or not there was actual misuse or abuse. And so that both reminds everyone to not jump the gun in making assumptions, but also highlights that the mere fact that the uses of the debt are not easily discoverable is itself deeply concerning in any democratic society. Or in any society. So those are very interesting points, and thank you very much. Our fourth speaker is Alexander Reethy. Alex, thank you for joining us. You're going to talk to us also about a country-level case, specifically Kenya. Public debt governance and opaque debt challenges are big news in Kenya these days, particularly through a very public series of lawsuits that have recently been filed, but also a growing public awareness of debt and public financial management issues. What is your perspective on the situation in Kenya? And could you provide a few examples of the causes and consequences of the current situation? Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, Erin, and the participants for this session. As you have said, the issue of hidden debt has become a big issue in our part of the world. And recently we've had what we are calling securitization, of which is basically collateralized debt instruments, where government goes out and securitizes a revenue stream. Basically, you take a loan and the collateral is a given revenue stream. This does not come in the regular loan books. We only get to hear of it when it starts affecting some of the tariffs that are affected. Maybe a good example is what we have currently, a securitized loan against our fuel. There is a revenue stream called the fuel levy in our country. So the government went and took a loan against this fuel levy. So what is now happening with the current global oil crisis due to the issues in the Middle East, it means that our fuel prices cannot go down to some levels because our fuel is already having a debt that is attached to it, and the person who is paying is you going to the pump. This is now becoming a big problem because now it is leading to a rapid increase in the cost of living, which is affecting every other individual in the country. The other hidden debts that we currently see are the guaranteed loans for state-owned enterprises. At times, we've seen the Auditor General even coming up with reports and indicating that some of our state-owned enterprises have loans attached to them that they're not even aware of. Even the state-owned enterprises do not know that there are loans that are taken against their balance sheets. So this is now again affecting how they operate, and the citizens have to foot the bills for paying off these particular loans. Now, the challenge that we have, the overall challenge we have, especially with these collateralized loans, is the fact that these affect future revenues, because we are borrowing against future revenues, meaning even future administrations, when they come, they cannot reverse some of these policies that have been put in place because already there is a debt that has been taken against it. This means like now our fuel and even what we call the sports fund, we will continue being there, and future governments cannot change those policies until that debt is fully repaid. So this means that we are tying future generations to debts that they did not participate in acquiring, and they did not even get to enjoy the benefits of those debts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and for keeping it brief. I appreciate that. You raised several really important issues, and one is the issue of the securitized loans and the impacts of that, particularly now with the fuel crisis in Kenya. But I also recall a few years ago there was quite a scandal around attempted securitization of gold in Ghana, and so all of this gets to a definition of debt and what counts. It also gets to the future generations' impacts that you mentioned very clearly. This is binding the hands of future governments, binding the hands of youth, and they're going to have to pay it off in the future. And particularly with the SOE debt that you mentioned, the fact that this is still guaranteed by the government, whether that is opaque through shortcomings and gaps in the legal framework, or whether it's opaque because the debt itself involves confidentiality clauses, is very difficult to unpack. So thank you very much. Sorry. Now we'll go back and we'd like to explore entry points and options for reform. What are some key things that need to be done to address these issues at the global, regional, and country level? I will ask and kindly remind our participants to try to keep comments brief to about 3 minutes. Daniela, we'll go back to you first. Now that we have a big picture understanding of the global hidden debt issue, what do we do to counter it? And particularly, how can we address the rising use of confidentiality clauses imposing silence on the borrower? Daniela.
Great. No, thank you very much for this, Erin, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. So I think the first point, and I think something that comes very clearly also from the interventions of the other colleagues, is that we cannot see this issue of hidden debt from an only perspective. So we cannot only see it from the borrower's perspective, we cannot only see it from the lender's perspective, but we need to include the systemic understanding of which are the dynamics that are enabling hidden debt and how to prevent them. So I'll try to divide my recommendations, but be very brief, into kind of like main dimensions. So the first one is what we can do globally, specifically looking at the lenders and specifically looking at the global financial infrastructure in terms of transparency and anti-corruption in debt management. And the first, and maybe the first recommendation would be, we had an interesting advance, I would say, in terms of commitments last year with the fourth Financing for Development agenda, in which the member states basically committed to develop a single global central debt data registry, which basically includes information that is fed both by the lenders as well as by borrowing governments, including IFIs and others. And something that is specifically relevant in this commitment is also the inclusion of private lenders. So there's been different initiatives, including by OECD and others, trying to increase the transparency of private lenders. As Patricia was saying, this is also one of the areas where we are seeing a lot of issues in terms of hidden debt, and by specifically including them as part of the single global central debt data registry is a step forward. I think what we have to do is really to enact and see where would this data registry would be hosted, by whom, and how we are going to guarantee that all the information is fed on a timely, on a complete, and on an accessible manner. The second point is very much aligned with this on how we can enhance cooperation in sharing that related information among creditor and borrower countries for data reconciliation, but also, and reiterating what I said before, on how to include specific private lenders into this type of initiatives to share their information. And then maybe the third point at the creditor level is how we can standardize confidentiality clauses as part of lending agreements. As we mentioned in the previous intervention, we're seeing this increased use of confidentiality clauses by specific lenders. So how we can start working towards a standardized clause that really limits the use of confidentiality and that agrees or doesn't go against national regulation, as we were mentioning before. So that when we see that there's a conflict between this standardized clause from the lending agreements and borrowing countries' regulation, the borrowing countries' regulation should go first and should be used in a process of strategic litigation should there would be one in the future. And then at the national level, and I'm sure the other colleagues would have a lot of recommendations to include here. So maybe I have 3 or 4 main points that I'll try to give very brief. So the first, very much aligned with some of the issues that we identify, is how borrower countries can enact legislation that mandate proactive full debt transparency, and how this can be complete, how this can be on a transaction level information, and how this can be timely, as we were discussing a bit with the Senegalese case. And this would include from clear definitions in the laws of what is public debt, by whom, including state-owned enterprises and subnational loans, as we're discussing, as well as how this information should be disclosed proactively. It should also include a comprehensive coverage of institutions and different types of instruments, including bonds, contingent liabilities, rather than defining a closed list, but leaving kind of like an open perspective on the regulation to include all of them. And principles of proactive disclosure should apply. So unless it is specifically defined in the law that a specific provision in a loan shouldn't be published during a specific period of time, the government should be open by default disclosing and publishing this information. The second point, very much limited to confidentiality, is how we can include concrete exceptions within request to information law. So very, very specifically define which would be the exceptions and under which concrete cases can we define specific information as confidential. And this should also be time bounded and, as we said, applicable to a specific parts of a loan and not to the loan as a whole itself. And then the third point is that even when information is confidential, there should exist specific provisions that oversight institutions should have access under concrete conditions to this information. So, for example, the Parliament or supreme audit institutions, there are provisions under access to information laws in which they can access classified information as confidential for specific purposes of audits or for oversight more broadly as part of the parliamentary. So maybe just to summarize this part on confidentiality, is even if confidentiality should be included, this has to be limited to a minimum, and this shouldn't necessarily exclude the oversight by Parliament and by supreme audit institutions. And maybe just to close, because this was also something that was mentioned by the previous panelist, we cannot see transparency without considering accountability. So, and I think Patricia was hinting into this, not only disclosure because of the sake of disclosure, but how we can really increase the capacities of oversight that go from the capacities of parliaments to really access the information timely, to have the capacities to exercise their oversight, but also through supreme audit institutions. And in the case of Senegal, as Matar was mentioning, not only looking at the existence or not of debt itself, but also in the implementation of performance audits of debt. So in line with what Patricia was saying in terms of how we can monitor the use of these loans and really see the impact of how the loans were being used. But we will close it here for now and happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. And again, I put a link to the report that NDI, Transparency International, and the Open Government Partnership did on confidentiality clauses in the chat. Some of the issues that Daniela spoke about are mentioned there. I do think that just a couple of things, really emphasizing the call for a single global registry and the inclusion of private lenders. We need data interoperability. So I think bringing open data principles to the publication and proactive disclosure of debt data is critical. If the data can't talk to each other and people can't understand it, it serves no purpose. And then ensuring that borrower laws are, especially on public disclosure, are a condition of validity and enforceability. I did also want to flag Matar is next, and if any participants have specific questions for individual panelists, you are free to put them in the chat, and I encourage our panelists to go ahead and respond to questions in the chat as we're having the conversation. Matar, I apologize. Patricia, turning to you, because I was going to say, Matar, you have a question in the chat. Patricia, turning back to the Latin America regional situation and perspective. So even though the causes and consequences are specific to each country of the debt situation, what do you see as a path forward to curb the problem within the region, such as legal reforms that Daniela was mentioning, policy changes, or even soft power tools that could make an impact?
Thank you, Erin. I would like to, Daniela mentioned that we need bylaws, and I think that fits to all countries, and even if we talk about borrowers and lenders. So I would like to add in the use also of tools related to and to be included in bylaws, and I will mention two. One is, for instance, the fiscal risk that public-private partnerships have in terms of the fiscal risk and how they generate debt. So an important tool that several countries in Latin America don't really fully have at hand or use it is, for instance, the value for money tests. And this would provide, and this also should, we should have a transparent fiscal accounting and comprehensive disclosure of all the fiscal risk of PPPs and the use of this tool. So this kind of mix and combination, also not just the bylaw, but also the tool that would feed into this. A second example is the debt sustainability analysis that includes projections for the next 10, 15 years with assumptions that are not known, are not public, and in some cases are known ex post when the debt sustainability analysis is already approved or agreed within a credit agreement with the International Monetary Fund, for instance. But in most cases, it's not known, and they're usually over-optimistic. And we have several examples in Latin America where debt sustainability analysis present good results that a country is able to repay a debt, so this country can increase their debt levels, but with over-optimistic projections. So this is important also to be transparent and to be that all stakeholders in a country are aware and know and could have also contributions to this kind of projections and in terms of assessing how sustainable is a debt for a country. And in general, I would like to also add that it's not only to have transparency and accountability regarding loans or contracts, past or new ones. It's also important to have all this information in other processes, for instance, in debt restructuring processes. And I mean debt renegotiations and also debt swaps. And we have examples in some countries in Latin America, Ecuador, for instance, where the debt swap in Galapagos was not transparent. And finally, on the Global Debt Data Registry, the host will be the World Bank. As far as I understand, the World Bank has started to analyze and in terms of what its role will be. But besides the importance of having a unique and comprehensive debt database for everyone and fed by countries, for borrower countries, lender countries, and so on, what civil society organizations have been calling for in the process of financing for development towards the Compromiso de Sevilla was also to have a global registry to know who is the final bondholder of a sovereign debt. And Argentina is one of the examples in Latin America when Argentina was wanted to start to renegotiate their debt. Argentina and the government of Argentina didn't know who was the final bondholder. They didn't know who to negotiate it with. And this information exists, but it's not public. So this kind of information, it's also part of this global debt registry that CSOs were calling for towards Sevilla. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Once again, you've touched on some very important things, and just to very lightly touch on some of them is the value for money tests. I think there is, and we've been discussing this with some colleagues at WFD as well, is the importance of bringing in broader sets of analytical tools. So to move away in some countries from essentially accounting to actually do political economy analysis, value for money tests, both prospectively and retrospectively. And you also raised, when you were talking about some of the rosy or unrealistic projections that are used for debt sustainability analysis, that also raises questions about sort of the underlying methodologies that are applied by international financial institutes and the international financial architecture that we have relied on, which is not working effectively. And that also touches on some of the questions I'm seeing in the chat relating to odious debt issues. Though debt may be odious, it often is still repaid in these days. So turning now to Matar to discuss Senegal. And I will, Matar, After you are done speaking, I will draw your attention. There is a chat button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and if you open it, you will see several questions addressed to you that perhaps you can respond to while Alexander is speaking. But for now, Matar. So based on the lessons from the hidden debt scandal so far in Senegal, how do you see the government moving forward to strengthen accountability and transparency in debt management in the future to prevent similar hidden debt issues from rising again? So this is for Matar.
Merci beaucoup, merci vraiment. Je pense que effectivement, c'est comme on avait dit dans la première partie de notre intervention, c'était donc en application de la réglementation que les autorités actuelles donc ont procédé à l'audit de la situation financière économique. Maintenant, donc là, à l'issue, il a été révélé donc une dette considérée comme cachée. Donc, aux autorités, je pense que vraiment, encore une fois, et là, ce n'est pas seulement au Sénégal, mais à tous les États. Donc là, vraiment, il faut respecter la réglementation, surtout dans ce contexte de surendettement, mais également de crise de la dette. Parce que vraiment, encore une fois, il y va même parfois donc, de l'avenir donc vraiment des populations, donc des générations, parce que le taux d'endettement très élevé, ça risque d'avoir des conséquences donc vraiment sur des générations. Pas vraiment, je pense que de ce point de vue, vraiment, il faut respecter la réglementation. D'ailleurs, laquelle réglementation dit clairement, par exemple, le code de transparence donc, dans la gestion des finances publiques nous dit les impacts des finances publiques sur l'économie à court, moyen et long terme sont mis en évidence pour que chacun puisse prendre conscience des enjeux qu'ils représentent. Là, c'est une obligation. C'est vraiment le code de transparence au niveau de l'UEMOA, mais également il y a une loi pas portant donc un code de transparence également qui est adopté au niveau national. Plus explicite même, le code nous dit les citoyens, à la fois contribuables et usagers des services publics, sont clairement, régulièrement et complètement informés de tout ce qui concerne la gouvernance et la gestion des fonds publics. Ils sont mis en capacité d'exercer dans le débat public leur droit de regard sur les finances de toutes les administrations publiques. Là, vraiment, c'est la réglementation. Et je dis que, vraiment, donc là, ces obligations, malheureusement, ne sont pas respectées, y compris par les autorités actuelles. Parce qu'encore une fois, vraiment, encore une fois, sur le niveau d'endettement, sur les dettes contractées, là, il n'y a pas cette transparence qui est attendue. Effectivement, et surtout, je dis que c'est un peu un paradoxe parce que c'est vraiment sur la base du travail qu'on a révélé donc, une dette cachée, n'est-ce pas? Donc là, il faut tout faire pour éviter que cette dette cachée-là également soit notée donc vraiment dans la gouvernance actuelle. Et là, je pense, effectivement, je donnerai l'exemple donc de la dette contractée en 2025, n'est-ce pas? Donc là, s'il n'y avait pas, par exemple, la publication de Financial Times, là, les Sénégalais n'ont jamais eu connaissance de l'existence de cette dette. N'est-ce pas? Donc là, c'est à la suite de la publication de Financial Times que les Sénégalais donc, ont appris qu'en 2025, il y avait véritablement une dette qui était contractée auprès de banques étrangères, de banques internationales. N'est-ce pas? Donc là, et déjà, donc là, l'article de Financial Times disait que c'était 650 000 euros. N'est-ce pas? Donc là, c'est l'équivalent de à peu près 426 milliards de francs CFA. Et donc, à la suite de cette publication, les autorités, effectivement, donc là, notamment le ministère des Finances, donc, a parlé de cette dette et donc là, vraiment, au lieu même de confirmer seulement le montant qui était révélé, mais là, il est allé plus loin. C'est-à-dire, donc là, donc de la conférence de presse, on constate qu'effectivement, le taux était à peu près, donc la dette était à peu près 1000 milliards de dollars. N'est-ce pas? Donc là, il a dit que par 1000 millions de dollars, je veux dire. Donc là, il a dit que c'était 721 milliards de francs CFA. Donc là, vraiment, je pense que c'est quelque chose qui n'était pas révélé. Les Sénégalais n'étaient pas au courant. Tout comme aujourd'hui, l'État, effectivement, recourt à des APE, n'est-ce pas, appel public à l'épargne. là, les Sénégalais n'ont pas, encore une fois, d'informations exhaustives sur ce qu'il y a dans ces APE. Donc là, on reçoit seulement des communiqués où on dit que le Sénégal, donc véritablement, a prélevé sur le marché, n'est-ce pas, donc un montant. Pardon, là, je pense que vraiment, de ce point de vue, on appelle vraiment l'État à respecter la réglementation, à respecter le principe de transparence et de redevabilité. Mais surtout, à respecter donc vraiment le délai de la périodicité de publication des bulletins statistiques de la dette publique. Parce que vraiment aussi, donc là, chaque trimestre, normalement, il devrait y avoir un bulletin sur la dette publique, mais malheureusement, ce n'est pas respecté de ce point de vue. Et je pense que vraiment, encore une fois, pour terminer, le Forum civil a à plusieurs reprises donc interpellé l'État sur l'obligation de respecter le principe de transparence et de redevabilité. D'ailleurs, donc il l'avait fait au mois de février en demandant à l'État de publier donc, le rapport Mazar. Déjà, on parlait de dette cachée. Je vous ai dit que la Cour des comptes avait dit que c'était donc l'encours c'était à peu près 100%. Mais le rapport Mazar a parlé donc vraiment de 132% du PIB. Donc là, mais malheureusement, ce rapport-là n'a pas fait l'objet de publication. Le Forum civil a demandé à ce que cela soit publié. Ce n'est pas le cas. Tout comme donc la dette que j'ai évoquée tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire donc révélée par Financial Times, à l'issue donc vraiment de cet article, le Forum civil avait interpellé également l'État pour demander à ce que véritablement les informations relatives à cette dette soient publiées, n'est-ce pas, pour que les Sénégalais soient au courant. Donc là, vraiment, en résumé, pour dire vraiment encore une fois, on appelle les États à respecter la réglementation, à respecter le principe de transparence, à respecter le principe de redevabilité, surtout au Sénégal, où il y a quelques mois, une loi sur l'accès à l'information est adoptée. N'est-ce pas? Avec cette loi, normalement, la transparence devrait être donc véritablement faire le principe et non le contraire. Merci encore.
Thank you, Matar. And again, I apologize to participants for our timeline, but if you can stay with us for a few more minutes, we have Alexander to comment next. Just quickly for our panel, for our participants who had questions for Matar about the situation in Senegal, on whether or not there's an audit on the uses of debt, what accountability is in place. I think as his presentation just explored, there are still transparency gaps happening even with the hidden debt audit findings. And their civil forum is currently trying to get reports released. So the situation is very much in flux. So turning now to Alexander, learning from the Kenya experience, what can civil society do to push the borrowing government and other borrowing entities to strengthen transparency and accountability in debt management, particularly since Kenya actually has quite a strong legal framework? So unlike some other countries where proactive disclosure is not necessarily required, Kenya does have these rules, and we still have this challenge. So what do you see as the way forward? Alexander.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start from where you have stopped and indicate that in a Kenyan context, we have a very good legal infrastructure in terms of even making sure that debt and other public information is made available. Our constitution at Article 35 provides for access to information, and we have an access to information. So what we've been doing in our case, we all know that the debt information can be quite complex. So what we've been doing is to try and get into the government websites where this debt information is presented in a rather opaque manner, in a manner that is very difficult for citizens to understand. And what we have been doing is to simplify this information for our citizens to understand. We have also been trying to build open dashboards where we can show citizens that this is where our debt levels are. This is what the impact it's having on the social services, so that they get to understand that the debts that our country is incurring is affecting their day-to-day lives. Also, what we are doing, and this has been mentioned, we are also going through what we call public interest litigations to request for disclosure of information on debt. One of the actually, we have a court ruling that allowed us to get all debt contracts released to the civil society organizations. This unfortunately has not been done, and now we have already filed for contempt of court. And beyond these, we are also now even petitioning Parliament to ensure that some of this information is made available in a manner that citizens can easily understand. We are also involved in a lot of advocacy and even ensuring that debt information is understood, conducting a lot of civic education amongst citizens, university students, young people, so that they understand these fiscal decisions that are being taken on their behalf. They will impact their future. They have a relationship to the taxes that they are paying. Also, going forward, in our country, we had the IMF coming in to conduct what is called a governance and corruption diagnostic. And this report has not been made public. So what we are doing is to push for government to make this document public so that we can see the areas where we have weaknesses in our legal infrastructure and how we are conducting the borrowing and the debt acquisition. Finally, part of what we are doing in our country, the domestic debt has overtaken external debt. Now we have more domestic debt than external debt. But what we see is the domestic lenders are benefiting from domestic borrowing. So what we are doing now, we are also calling for an enhancement of beneficial ownership laws to ensure that we get to know if these are banks, insurance companies, and so on that are lending to our government. Can we get to know who is behind these particular banks, insurance companies, and so on, so that we don't have politically exposed persons using the influence they have to come up with the budgets and fiscal policies to induce domestic borrowing by ensuring that our budget has a budget deficit, so that then they end up lending to our government to rip us off. That has a direct correlation with the conflict of interest, and this is something that we're pushing for, and we hope that as many citizens can get to understand that the increase in domestic borrowing means somebody is benefiting from it domestically, and we need to know who is benefiting from this and the influence they have over fiscal policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And again, you touched on a lot of important things there. One overarching issue that is also very important in our programming together, is raising public awareness. If there is not a pressing political or a sense of urgency for officials to address these issues by the public and by voters, very little will change, unfortunately. Thank you also for highlighting the issues around the relationship between access to information, right to information laws, and government obligations to reactively disclose, and the challenges you're facing with that. And what you raised is an issue that we should have another webinar to discuss, is the pivot toward domestic lending. Not only does that change the debt landscape and the entire sort of fiscal situation in a country, in part by crowding out space for investment in other domestic private enterprise, but as you raised, the issue of beneficial ownership transparency is really important, particularly in a place like Kenya, where civil servants and public officials can have these private interests under the law. There is no sort of deconflicting rules like there are in some other countries. So those are very important questions or issues that you raised. We are over time, but I would like to suggest for our participants who raised very good questions in the chat, what I have done is copy down each of the questions, including your names. And what we will do is have each of our panelists respond to the questions that were specific to them. And I will ask panelists to respond to the broader questions for the whole group in writing. And we will send out an email to all of the participants that have joined us today that have these written responses to your questions, because they are important. And I actually think that there's a lot more discussion, papers, reports that we should write. So hopefully this is the first of several conversations. But we will respond in writing, and we will also share this recording so that you can follow up. In the email response, I will put my email and the emails of other panelists, if they're okay with that, for us to have a direct follow-up. But basically, what this has highlighted to me is the way that these issues all
Oui,
intersect.
c'est bon, hein. Vous pouvez donner.
One more time, Matar, sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We will do that. So these issues are intersecting, and the use of confidentiality clauses is really adding a layer of complication to what was already a very complex set of transparency barriers. The non-central government debt, the growing use of debt by SOEs, the use of special purpose vehicles, public-private partnerships, securitized lending, and other very complex forms of debt are making it difficult to have transparency anyway. When you add confidentiality rules to this, it makes it extremely difficult, even when that violates the law. And as the Kenya case revealed, trying to bring in the courts is one tool, but it is not a silver bullet. That also takes time and resources. And a Senegal situation has shown us there is a lot still being unraveled there. And even the new right to information law has not helped increase transparency so far in this case. It's a complicated issue, but there are solutions through legal and institutional reform and public pressure. NDI and Transparency International and all of our partners here remain ready to help you with this. So again, apologies for the for the time issues with questions. We will reply in the email, and I will close that out. Thank you very much to our panelists for joining us and to our participants for their time. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Erin, and everyone. Merci. Au revoir.